Hi, and welcome to Sociology 1. We started with what is socialization, and now we're going to consider sociological and psychosociological theories of human development. It helps us grasp all the elements that contribute to how we become who we are. We're also going to see how socialization continues throughout our lives. So let's get started. The sociological theories to human development. Now, sociology acknowledges the importance of how the social world, that's other people and the world around us, the environment, participate in our development of who we are ourselves and learn about the culture in which we live. Self-concept is the totality of our beliefs, feelings, and awarenesses about ourselves. So all of what we carry about who we are is our self-concept. The origins of self-concept is the work done by Cooley and Mead. And I should say they didn't create it, they just sort of discovered and coined the phrases, if you will. And this is going back to the 1860s when Charles Horton Cooley, he came up with what he coined as the looking glass self. We can imagine how our personality and appearance look to others. That's part of the looking glass self. By seeing how other people treat us, it gives us this sort of awareness. We imagine how others judge our appearance, our personality, and if we think others view us in a positive or negative view, our self is either enhanced or diminished. And because we have so many people in our lives at varying degrees of familiarity and importance, all of that feedback helps shape who we are. Now, George Herbert Mead, he introduced some central concepts, one of them of which was role-taking. And the role-taking is the process by which a person mentally assumes the role of another person in order to understand the world from that person's point of view. Now, children do this not so much to understand from the point of view, but to imitate, if you will. Role-taking through play. My daughter, when she was in daycare, I used to go to do some work at daycares. I was a behavior consultant. I'd go and observe children at daycares. And I would watch her play house, and I could see how she was taking the role of either me or my wife at that time, her mom. And so it was just role-taking in that the only exposure to being a parent was her own parents. That's what comes through in terms of role-taking. Now, the other component that's really important is that of what is known as a significant other. Those persons whose care, affection, and approval are especially desired and who are most important in the development of self. Now, what's important about that term, significant others, you would assume parent, maybe a coach, another family member, a teacher, someone who is important. However, we don't self-define as significant others. Children are attracted to different people for different reasons, but can become a significant other unbeknownst to the adult. And so I've always said it's important when we are with children to be aware that we could be viewed as a significant other to a child, and how we behave and what we say about them could be very important in what helps contribute to who they are and how they develop in their self-concept. Mead continued by dividing the self into two parts, the I and the me. The I represents the spontaneous individual aspects of oneself, the subjective part, my own view of the world around me, if you will. The me is aware of the societal attitudes and expectations, the objective part, the one that knows that this isn't right. In our community or in our society, this isn't something I'm supposed to do. The I develops first. The me goes through 3 stages of development. The first is what's known as the preparatory stage. There's no role taken in this first stage. It's more about imitation. So children under the age of 3 who are mimicking, they're preparing for role taking. They haven't quite got to the point where they could grasp the bigger picture. The second order of development is what's known as play. Taking the role of another person, 3 to 5 years old, where they're pretending. And you can see that all the time. I mean, I watch that in my daughter. I've seen that in children lots of the time, where they just sort of play act and pretend. The third is game. And this is where taking the role of others in many situations. So here, we're not only taking on a role, we are aware of that role in regards to other people. That's where we start to develop that social component, that bigger picture view, that objective point of view. So having looked at the sociological approach, now we're going to look at the psychological perspective on understanding our development. And we're going to look at some major theorists in this group. We're going to look at Freud, Piaget, Kohlberg, and Gilligan, not Gilligan's Island. For Freud, the stages of human development focused on three interrelational forces, and we've talked about these before, or you may have taken it in psychology, and that is the ego, and the superego. The id is the part of that contains our basic biological drives. It's what's beneath the surface. We don't generally see them, but they are always talking to our ego and our superego. Well, I want this met. I want this. The ego and the superego mediate that. So it's our biological drives and needs, and they demand immediate attention. The balance in the id is the ego. The ego filters and contains the id and attempts to meet the id's needs in a way that will advantage us the best. The superego is the check and balance for both the id and the ego. It's our conscience, the moral and ethical part of our personality. And so from Freudian perspective, it's that dynamic of the three that sort of coordinate to help us become who we are ourselves. Jean Piaget, those of you in ECE will be familiar with Jean Piaget. The issue is cognitive development, and he was interested in how we think. Piaget believed that there were stages to our cognitive development. We didn't come complete, we developed. Children needed to go through these stages in order to in the order in which they occurred. So in him, there were stages, and each stage needed to go in a specific order, and children needed to develop their cognitive skill sets in that particular order. Children will proceed through these stages in relatively the same amount of time. So all kids in grade 1, at some point in that grade 1 year, will meet certain stages of Jean Piaget. So as we age, we change how we think. So his key concepts, his key stages. The first was the sensomotor stage, and that was from birth to about 2. And then there was the pre-operational stage, from about 2 to about 7 years old. The concrete operational, 7 to 11 years of age, and then the formal operational, 12 through to adolescence. You'll find more detail in your textbook. Now, Kohlberg, he introduced more of a moral development, and it's sort of following the lead of Piaget, in which Kohlberg came up with a series of stages throughout a person's life focused on moral dilemmas. So the classification of moral reasoning comes in 3 levels. There's a pre-conventional level, that's between ages of 7 and 10. And then there's a conventional level, 10 through our adult life. And then there's a post-conventional level. This comes in our adult life, but it's not something that everybody attains, according to Kohlberg. Now, Carol Gilligan, she felt that this issue that the issue of moral development needed to include gender. Gilligan is a major critic of Kohlberg's theory. Kohlberg's model was developed solely on the basis of research with male respondents, and that has been a source of a lot of gendered gaps, is that much of the research was done by men on mostly men. Women and men often have diverging views on morality based on differences in socialization and life experience from her perspective. So we couldn't compare what men experience and what women experience. They need to be 2 different sets, so it needs to be broader. So why is socialization, and I've mentioned this earlier, a lifelong process? We continue to learn throughout our whole life. When we experience a change in status, going to university, getting our first job, or marrying, we learn a whole new sets of rules, roles, and relationships. Some people gain their only experience on how to be a parent by having watched their own parents. Even if they said, when I get to have a kid, I'm going to raise them quite differently than you do, and find themselves by the time they're 35 and looking back at how they're raising their kids, they find themselves doing the very same thing their parents did. How did that happen? Part of it is, where do we learn other than through our family? And how do we engage that within our own family? How many couples get together and talk about how they plan on parenting? It doesn't happen that frequently. In my counseling role that I played many years ago, that was probably one of the most common reasons people broke up and found things difficult, was no dialogue about how we're going to do things, no shared belief system. Another type of socialization is known as anticipatory socialization, the process by which knowledge and skills are learned for future roles. So, new job skills, being a post-secondary, a college student. Classes are your pre-job socialization. If you're in nursing, you're learning how to be a nurse, so when you apply for a job in nursing, they think you've got all those skills required to be a successful nurse. Stages of development through a lifetime. We are always adjusting. There's central concerns during infancy and early childhood. Family supports and guidance are crucial to a child's developing. So when we look at stages developed through a lifetime, the first sort of group, if you will, we are a part of is childhood. And the central concern there is, our early childhood and infancy. What degree of family support do we have? How have our parents interacted with us? What are the things that they've said? What guidance have they given us, if any? It's all crucial for our development of self-concept, this early childhood part. Some of the central activities is carefree play, safety and freedom from economic, political, and sexual responsibilities. Childhood isn't something that has been a part of society forever. At one point, not that long ago, less than 100 years ago, children worked. The same as we work, making money for the family, or worked on the farm. So childhood has only been something that's been coined since the 50s, when we started to see that children didn't need to work, that we could work in factories, we could make a living, and we should raise children. And childhood was about carefree play, it became. Some of the issues in childhood, physical and emotional support necessary. And the risks, of course, would be sexual abuse and its negative outcomes for children's development. The second sort of grouping is adolescence. In industrialized societies, its adolescence stage represents the buffer between childhood and adulthood. Adolescence, we might try out some jobs, part-time, even full-time, but for the most part, part-time, trying it out in adolescence, spreading our wings, separating ourselves from our family, getting familiar with independence. So some of the common themes, emotional and social unrest, learning how to be more growing up goes through some positive and negative, both socially and emotionally. Some struggle and conflict between parental wishes and peer pressure. And it's that figuring out who I am in the mix of all my social groups is difficult. The transition from upper to middle class families to higher education. That issue around, do we have access to higher education? And if we do, what do I pursue? Is put upon us in our adolescence. The third grouping, that of adulthood. And there's three foci in adulthood. Work in a paid labor force is important. The development of intimate relationships and often resulting in marriage and having children. And third, seeking personal fulfillment. Now we can add to this group of adulthood a fourth group, and that is the late adulthood. Because in a late adulthood, we see that it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, with the number of people, and we live longer and longer and longer. So as we get into what we normally had thought of as old age, we find people are living a whole 30 years beyond that. So we can add late adulthood and the issue of ageism. With the aging population and the baby boomers improving medical care, nutrition throughout our whole lives, we are living longer. Late adulthood could be diffused into 3 categories, and sociologists have started to look at old age, older adulthood, in 3 categories. The young old, 65 to 74, the old, that's 75 to 85, and the oldest old, over 85. If you look at the demographic population, you'll find there's in the neighborhood of 25% of the population by the year 2030 will be over the age of 65. A quarter of the population. Successful aging. Many elderly experience financial security, more freedom, health, and happiness. These new positive images of the elderly have come through. Ageism, to remind you, is prejudice and discrimination against people based on their age, particularly against the older people. Although it's not exclusive, certainly I'm sure as a teen you've probably felt age discrimination or ageism. And lastly is resocialization, the process of learning a new and different set of attitudes, values, and behaviors from those in one's previous background. So there's 2 kinds. There's voluntary and involuntary. Now, if I'm participating in a voluntary resocialization, I might be going to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, adult survivors of any group you can imagine. It's voluntary, I choose to go. Involuntary, jail, is an involuntary resocialization. You're supposed to come out better than you went in. Involuntary would be groups that you've gotten involved in where brainwashing has been a part of things, cults. So we have 2 different kinds, but of course we want to be choosing voluntary resocialization. All right, so I hope this chapter's been interesting to show you the degree of socialization that happens not just in our culture, but in every culture around the world. It's an important aspect of helping us become who we are. It's not just in our genetics, and it's not just us doing it to ourselves. We are so influenced throughout our lives by the social world around us. All right, everybody, keep up the good work, and we'll see you in next week's videos.